right, so our guest here today is our very own friend and neighbor, Valerie Myntti. Round of applause for Val. So she's going to be telling you a lot more about herself, certainly, but I just want to honor and celebrate her background that brings her here to us today. So she was born in Duluth, but has a heritage on the Iron Range. She was raised here with her family until they moved out of town for a while, out of state for a while. She has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degree, and she also went to law school. And so she's another one of our regional treasures who shares with us her knowledge, her experience, and her expertise. So I'm really excited to learn with you all today from our neighbor and friend, Val Myntti.
Okay, I have to get close to the microphone. I'm kind of a wanderer when I talk. I usually wander up and down the rows and gab away, but I'm stuck here by this microphone. I'm so pleased to see so many people. Some of my dad's friends, my dad would have been 100, have driven up from Duluth. I have friends from grade school who I have not seen since grade school, who came up today that I haven't seen since 5th grade that I was in school with in first. So thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. So my name is Valerie Myntti, and I'm here to present my family's Finnish immigration story. Some of this will resonate with you if you have immigration in your recent 5-generation past. Please know that I tend to throw in additional bits of information as I talk, so bear with me. And please understand that all of my digressions are germane to the subject. It can illuminate our current moment and might offer compassionate guidance to some of the vexing challenges of our times to know our immigration stories. I will end my presentation with a 5-minute kind of amateur slideshow, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I will end, so I'm happy to take questions at the end of the slideshow. So it's a good idea to start a program like this with a couple of caveats. First of all, I am not a professional historian, nor am I cheeky enough to think that I am offering an exhaustive history of the Finnish experience on the Iron Range. This is my family's personal story as told to me by my grandmother, father, and his siblings. It is a personal story that reflects their beliefs, their politics, their values, and nobody else's. And second, it's so important to know that Finns were not a monolithic group in their outlooks or their beliefs. No two Finns had an identical experience on the Iron Range or in Finland before they got here. I cannot reduce the rich, diverse Finnish experience by classifying the Finns who came here as church Finns, labor hall Finns, socialist Finns, or Finns who dabbled in communism. The reality was so much more nuanced and complicated. My sources for this talk are the oral histories of the Myntti clan, along with a great family friend, Clarence Ivonen. Sally Koski has conducted important research into the Co-op Park Association on Eagle's Nest, Lake 1. I used information from the Minnesota Historical Society as well as from the University of Minnesota archives, and various monographs and memoirs written by and about Finnish immigrants to Minnesota. For us to understand Finns on the Iron Range, we need to understand the historical context by which they came to the United States. It's crucial to understand what happened in Finland that caused such a massive move out of Finland. 350,000 Finns immigrated to the United States, and they became avid cooperative communitarians. So it is important to understand what the external forces were that shaped their worldview. So hang on to your seats as we take a romp through history, and let's cast our mind back to Finland in the 12th century. So From the early 12th century to the 19th, Finland was a province of Sweden. Sweden was the primary power in the Baltics until its regional primacy was challenged by Russia. By 1809, Sweden was so weakened, it was forced to cede its entire Baltic holdings to Russia, including Finland. Finland then became the autonomous part of the Russian Empire as the Grand Duchy of Finland from 1809 through 1917 during the Bolshevik Revolution. Initially, Finns were treated very well by the Russians. That could possibly mean they were ignored rather than abused or exploited. They were given free rein early on to speak their own language, to practice their own religion, celebrate their own culture and customs, and to obey their own laws and constitutions. They built their own schools and their cultural centers. This period of relative freedom was followed by a cruel crackdown. An all-out oppressive Russification effort ensued in about 1890. Almost overnight, the Finnish language, culture, schools, and legal institutions were outlawed and shut down. Finns now were largely unemployed, and those Finns who did work staged continual strikes, walkouts, and boycotts. This was a period of great turmoil and deprivation that dominated the opening years of the 20th century. There was widespread discontent, upheaval, and suffering by the Finnish masses during this period of time. But let me digress for a second. It is important to note that even in the midst of Russian control of Finland, that a remarkable 90% of Finns were literate and could read and write by 1880. There had always been an emphasis in Finland on literacy and education, even through today. Finland was and is ahead of its time, and I'm going to list a couple of those ways. Finland was the first European country to grant all citizens a right to vote, including all women, even indigenous Sami women from the north in 1906. As an aside, New Zealand women won the right to vote earlier in 1893, but it was an exclusive right for white women. The indigenous Maori were excluded from this right. American women did not vote until a full 14 years after Finnish women in 1920. Finland was one of the first Western countries to elect both a female president and prime minister. Fast forward to the 21st century when Finland made international headlines in 2019, when Miss Sanna Marin became the world's youngest serving prime minister, and her coalition government was made up of 5 parties, all led by young women. All of this is made possible and easier when a country has gender equity written into its constitution, as does Finland. In its constitution, Finland also gives all children the right to an excellent education, a right or privilege that is not dependent on parents' wealth or on their zip code. That right is credited for Finland's universally excellent educational system and is a global model for educational equity. So back to our immigration story. Finland declared independence from Russia in the midst of the Bolshevik Revolution and uprising in 1917. Immediately after gaining independence, a bitter civil war broke out in Finland after tensions exploded. These tensions among Finns had been simmering under the surface for years, but in large part, this was a political crisis arising out of World War I. Finns held 2 opposing worldviews and 2 opposing governing philosophies that the war laid bare, and they battled each other for political domination. Many of the same power struggles played out on the Iron Range, in Finnish communities, and in the Finnish cooperatives here in the first half of the 20th century. The two main groups battling for domination in Finland were the White and the Red Finns. The White Finns were supported by the German army during the Civil War. They tended to be middle class, wealthier, the shopkeepers, the emerging bourgeoisie. They were more nationalistic, tended to be church-going, and were considered the Finnish elite. On the other hand, the Red Finns had the following characteristics. They tended to be socialists, revolutionaries, the working class, the commoners, the industrial laborers, the agricultural workers, the labor activists, the agnostics and atheists, and the frustrated idealists and intellectuals who harbored visions of utopia. Russia sent the Red Finns military equipment. My family in Finland identified as Red Finns. My grandmother, Laura Jarvinen, lost several relatives in the Finnish Civil War, including a beloved brother who fought on the side of the Red Finns. My grandfather's father, Kalle Jarvinen, who had immigrated to the United States alone, leaving his family behind in Finland, died in a mine cave-in Rock Springs, Wyoming, when my grandmother was 3, before her dad saved enough money to send passage for his wife and 3 kids to sail for America. My grandmother's distraught mother, who would have been my great-grandmother, died of tuberculosis shortly thereafter, leaving her 3 orphan kids to be divided up and taken in by other relatives. These tragedies helped shape who my grandmother, Laura Jarvinen, became, including her worldview and her lifelong commitment to labor unions. These family stories also have shaped my own politics. As I said, the divisions that erupted in Finland and caused such heartbreak there followed the immigrants to their new communities here in America. My father believed that the Elite Finns tried very hard to put aside their differences and to live in harmony. They had suffered so much in Finland. The children all played together, and in times of need, the Finns rallied together to support other Finns, regardless of who they were, but if they needed help, and regardless of past affiliations. But according to my father, and he stuck to his story, the divisions remained on the Iron Range. The Ely miners, labor activists, and co-operators who made up the working class typically summered in areas like Co-op Point on Eagle's Nest Lake, shopped at their own co-ops, usually spent their Sundays at the labor hall, and had their own social clubs. The wealthier shopkeeping bourgeoisie or middle class tended to summer at Burnside Lake, shop at their own co-ops and attend their own churches and join their own clubs. But needless to say, there were so many exceptions to this rule. My grandmother had many Finnish friends from every background and belief because she was determined to leave the past behind. But like most immigrants in history, fleeing Finland was not so different from the Central Americans at our southern border, or the Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, Somalis, or other Africans desperately seeking refuge in Europe, in Australia, all risking their lives, coming with the shirts on their backs with hopes and dreams for a brighter future. Immigrants today, and my grandparents over 100 years ago, sought economic opportunity for themselves and for their kids. All immigrants desperately want to escape grinding poverty, war, famine, disease, hunger. They all want to escape violence, terrorist insurrections, civil war, or conscription into another's war. My father, my Finnish grandfather, refused to be drafted into the Russian army. Russia's fight for an expanding empire was not my grandfather's Finnish fight. Immigrants from any era want new lives that include a chance to work hard for fair pay and to live in a safe and peaceful place to raise their kids. My grandparents fleeing Finland were poor and they were given a chance. The Finns already here helped them find work and housing. And like other immigrants, my grandparents became proud, hardworking Americans filled with gratitude for their good fortune for all their days, despite some obvious bumps in the road. We must give that same opportunity to new immigrants today to throw out the same welcome mat that so many of our own ancestors received when they came. And after all, where we are born and to whom is not up to us, it is instead an accident of birth. We know immigrants can reinvigorate and breathe new life into our rural and urban areas, often taking difficult and unpleasant jobs that our families will not do. And in the process, these arrivals become proud and loyal Americans. The early 20th century Finns came to Minnesota because work was plentiful, the landscape familiar, and many Finns were already here. Duluth was known as the American Helsinki. They found work as domestic maids and miners in the mills and in the fisheries. My grandmother, Laura Jarvinen, who came to the United States alone as a teenager, found work as a domestic maid with a kind and generous family in Chisholm. My paternal great-grandparents, Isaac and Annalisa Myntti, settled on a farm in Pike Sandy and are buried in the Hope Lutheran Cemetery there. My grandfather's younger brother ran the Pike Sandy Co-op until his death in the 1950s. My grandfather, Charles, worked in the lumber mills and in Winton and in the Ely mines. My grandparents, Laura Jarvinen Myntti and Charles Myntti, are buried in the Ely Cemetery. My own parents, Don and Rita Myntti, are buried in the tiny Scandia Cemetery next door to Glen Sheen, overlooking Lake Superior. The early Finns had a reputation for hard work, and they were readily and easily employed. Finns also had a reputation for clannishness and for an incomprehensible language made up mostly of vowels. You know, when I'm talking to Finnish people like in Embarrass and wherever, they all stand up and start screaming at that one. All the incomprehensible language bit of vowels. Most Anglo-Saxons found it impossible to comprehend the beauty and health benefits of a Finnish sauna. My grandfather, Charles Myntti, was from Western Finland. There's a Myntti farm that still exists there today in continual operation since 1550. My grandmother, Laura Jarvinen, was born in Karkkila, an hour northwest of Helsinki. While they had suffered in Finland, they maintained their idealism. My grandparents were committed to creating their version of utopia here in America. They wanted to be part of a just and cooperative and intentional community. They wanted to be part of the great American experiment, but they knew that their lives in America would not be without its difficulties and challenges. Finnish workers soon began to organize themselves into unions on the Iron Range. It is thought that the Finns' ability to read and write helped them lead the labor movement. Finns led the strikes, the protests, and the walkouts in the mines, in the mills, and in the fisheries. They led the struggle for better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. In a moral universe, I ask, who can argue with that? Many locals considered the Finns folk heroes and joined their ranks. Others considered Finns subversive troublemakers and called them un-American and endlessly harassed them. My grandparents, along with other Finns, embraced a uniquely Finnish worldview in a philosophy formulated in the old country that they brought with them. And that was a blend of ideas taken from the cooperative ideology with its concept of mutual aid and the emphasis on the common good. Finns championed the common good over narrow self-interest at absolutely every opportunity. They took their ideas from socialist values, which to them simply meant working towards a morally conscious economy where the welfare of all is more important than individual profits, an economy that emphasizes equality, justice, and economic security for all. And of course, they took ideas from the labor unions. It is important to note that my grandparents were well versed in Marx and Engels. I have found boxes of pamphlets stashed away in my original cabin there. And my grandparents adopted certain communist ideas about fairness, about equity, about cooperation, but firmly rejected any ideas of violent revolution, class warfare, or anarchy. My people were law-abiding, peace-loving Eliites. I think we could benefit today from my grandparents' version of cooperative communitarianism, with the dominant attitude of you before me. So let me digress once again. So stick with me on this one. No word today in the English vocabulary strikes more fear in American hearts than the word socialism. The greatest irony is that socialism is already firmly entrenched in the United States, and most Americans in reality like it just fine. One can argue convincingly that in the United States, like in every other country with an advanced economy, such as the UK, Germany, France, and Japan, it is already a mixed economy of both socialist and capitalist programs, with many programs that serve the public good. When the government intervenes in an economy, such as introducing a minimum wage or enforcing child labor laws, a 40-hour work week, or provides us with Social Security, Medicare, or agricultural and energy subsidies, let us please understand that this is socialism at work. If these advancements were outlawed, we risk going back to living in the truly squalid world that Charles Dickens so brilliantly captures in his English novels of Hard Times and Bleak House, when it was only rapacious capitalism. It's good to revisit Dickens from time to time to remind ourselves how important our hard-won basic social and economic safety net is, especially when some American politicians today talk about cutting or eliminating it. Once again, we should banish our fear around words like socialism or immigration, especially when those words are weaponized for political reasons. When Nikki Haley, a serious Republican presidential candidate, described the remarkable Inflation Reduction Act last week on its one-year anniversary as a communist manifesto, you know that we have reached a new low in American electoral politics. As you remember, the Inflation Reduction Act brings the United States significantly closer to meeting the 2030 climate targets of cutting emissions that are helping to transform, and many other provisions that are helping to transform the economy and the lives of everyday Americans. Fear-mongering and disinformation is unworthy of American presidential candidates. The real debate today is not between having a capitalist or a socialist economy. Folks, that horse left the barn about 90 years ago. The real and honest debate is about the appropriate balance between the two competing economic systems and the kind of just and humane world we wish to inhabit in it today and moving into the future. According to the Minnesota Historical Society, and I quote, "From the beginning, many Finns were active in the progressive politics, spearheading the labor movement on the Iron Range. And along with other Nordic immigrants, the Finns played a dominant role in Minnesota's protest politics that paved the way for better wages, hours, and working conditions." End quote. The Minnesota Historical Society further states, "The Finnish vision of Minnesota's cooperative commonwealth would become the guiding principles of the farmer labor movement that started as a coalition of rural farmers and city laborers during the time of great economic distress during the Great Depression. In 1944, the Farmer Labor Party merged with the Democratic Party to form the DFL. The farmer labor's Finnish members successfully pushed the Democrats to the left, end quote. Finns who worked in the mines and advocated for broadening union membership in the Western Federation of the Miners, the IWW and the CIO faced greater discrimination than other Finns or ethnicities. Mine owners blamed Finns for creating labor unrest and spreading subversive ideas. It was not uncommon to see signs through, that's true, they did. I mean, they did. That was a good point. Was that you, Frederica?
No.
Okay, Betsy, we're on the same page. It was not uncommon to see signs throughout Minnesota declaring no Finns, Indians, or dogs allowed. Reminiscent of the signs in the American South in front of hotels and restaurants that proclaimed no Blacks, Jews, or dogs allowed. There was a serious effort to keep new Finnish immigrants from coming to the United States, as well as an effort to kick out Finns who were already here. Several specious academic papers were published proclaiming that Finns were really Mongolians in disguise and should be excluded under the Asian Exclusion Act. These authors were eventually discredited for their bigotry towards Finns, not to mention their bigotry towards Mongolians and other Asians. The authors were discredited and unmasked as bigots. But I must digress for another second and tell you I made a really interesting recent discovery. I signed up for 23andMe about 8 years ago to better understand my ancestry and my genetic health picture via a DNA test. Initially, I got an ancestry chart made up of about 46% Finnish from my father and 45% French from my mother. So there was no surprise there, but 9% of me was unknown. However, in the past several months, I got an astonishing update on my ancestry chart, and it indicates, believe it or not, I have bits and bobs of Mongolian and Manchurian ancestry. I mean, okay, so like, wow. So this indicates, I think, in a fascinating way, the migration of people. I mean, there's parts of the way the Korean sentence structure is put together that is similar to Finnish and to Hungarian. I mean, it's fascinating. But there's also the prolific breeding of the fearsome Mongol warrior, Genghis Khan, who is estimated to have 16 million descendants today. We all might have bits and bobs of Mongolian in our DNA. So maybe those disgraced academics were onto something. Maybe they were, but it was unforgivable that they used their theories and their platforms as academics in an outrageously bigoted and racist way to exclude people like Finns and Asians from living in America. Vigilantes on the Iron Range, however, did not discriminate between Finns who were labor union activists from less radical, church-going Finns. Vigilantes attacked and assaulted Finnish immigrants as un-American, whatever their backgrounds were. Finns came to the United States from Finland with an already well-formulated, well-developed cooperative ethos, deprivation under the Russians, and an entrenched way of living in Finland for centuries made the values of mutual aid and the emphasis on the common good centerpieces of the Finnish philosophy, where neighbors for centuries had pooled their resources and they bought the farmers in their neighborhood equipment like grain elevators or dairy equipment, or put up a barn for them, all for the common good. For many hundreds of years, achieving common goals by banding together and pooling resources was a Finnish practice. This unique form of cooperative socialism and enlightened self-interest came with the Finns when they emigrated to America, and these values formed the Finnish identity and ethos. Finns created co-ops on the Iron Range out of necessity and out of the need or the desire for self-determination. Their creation on the range was directly related to the discrimination directed at them for the activities of the Finnish union activists. Local merchants, the company stores, and wholesalers all sympathized with the mining bosses and the mining companies during the long labor strikes of 1907 and of 1916 that were led by Finns. These stores refused to extend credit to the Finnish miners during this very difficult time, and the Finns refused to be victims, and to that end created consumer cooperatives, retail businesses that were democratically run and owned by workers who bought a share. Co-ops were seen as an alternative economic model to capitalism. The co-op business model was not driven solely by profits, but obviously making a profit was important. The difference was that the profits did not go to unknown shareholders from someplace else and sort of starve the company of resources. Instead, they were given to each local shareholder as a small quarterly dividend. And importantly, the profits were used to plow back into the businesses to enhance goods and services and to lower prices. Co-ops were initially thought to be positively un-American. Most Finnish cooperators had absolutely no desire to overthrow capitalism, as they were accused of doing, but believed co-ops offered a correction to the vagaries of capitalism. They wanted to address the deficiencies of capitalism by fighting monopolistic higher pricing, by offering goods and services at the lowest rock bottom prices. And co-ops, as we all know, were willing to service rural areas that traditional retailers would not do. For Finnish immigrants, consumer cooperatives acted as far more than a retailer, but as the center of Finnish American life on the Iron Range, along with the labor union halls. It was an all-encompassing philosophy, a holistic approach to maintaining their language, customs, and values in their new homes in America. Finns ignored rampant discrimination and built their own stores and their own cultural institutions across the Iron Range and across the upper Midwest, since Finns were barred from joining Anglo clubs. They created co-ops that included dairies, creameries, car dealerships, mortuaries, grocery stores, cafes, restaurants, clothing shops, credit unions, only to name a few. Finns also built incredible cultural and educational institutions across the upper Midwest. The Iron Range is dotted with this beautiful architecture. They built opera houses, theaters, social clubs, workers' halls. They started newspapers and publishing houses, opened libraries, had adult educational centers. They opened schools, nursery through college. They had sports leagues, and they had summer communal settlements like kids camps, like Co-op Point on Eagle's Nest and Masaba Co-op Park near Cherry, Minnesota. Down the road in Cherry, Minnesota, lived a band of renegade Finns led by a gentleman named Arvo Hallberg, better known as Gus Hall, who took these beliefs a step further. Mr. Hall went on to lead the American Communist Party for the last half of the 20th century. He died in Yonkers, New York in 2000. Gus Hall ran for the US presidency 4 times, and he lost 4 times. The cooperative way, in large part, was antithetical to the American values of the day. America focused on the rugged individual who could pull himself up by his bootstraps, who did it alone without any help, as the myth goes. The Finnish cooperators, on the other hand, emphasized community. They emphasized cooperation, mutual aid, where folks helped each other, and together they all got ahead. It's time to share with you some of my dad's specific memories of his boyhood in Ely. My dad, Donald Charles Myntti, was born in Chisholm in 1923. Shortly, the family moved to Ely, where he graduated from Ely Memorial High School in 1941. My father graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in mechanical engineering and a specialty in mining, and spent his life working in mines around the world or consulting for them into his early 90s. His father, Charles, was one of the original men who helped develop Co-op Point. My dad, Don, and his sister, Onerva Delight, Ona for short, spent every summer there while growing up. Dad's much younger brother, 25 years younger, missed out on all the fun. His life believed he had the happiest boyhood imaginable and a wonderful life. He did not speak English until he was 7 years old and went to school in the Ely public school system. He had all kinds of friends, Finns and non-Finns. He built lifelong friendships that lasted until his death a year ago. Dad would have turned 100 a week ago. He attributes his long and healthy life and happy life in large part to his Finnish upbringing, to the cooperative spirit, including the communal Finnish sauna, where folks, all the old grannies and granddaddies gathered to solve the world's problems. And I think they were trying to solve Don's problems too. The Finns who summered at Co-op Point built a unique intentional community based on their shared values. They believed the importance of the ideals of cooperation and in their unique brand of socialism, and that it had to be passed on to the next generation. Some of Co-op Point's original members helped lead the range cooperative movement, like Mike Simonson from Virginia, who led this whole situation on Eagle's Nest. Others worked in consumer cooperatives, but most of the Co-op Point members worked in the mines, and some were labor union activists. My grandfather, Charles Myntti, stood in solidarity his entire life with the IWW and later with the CIO, and helped to grow their membership. In the late 20s and early 30s, approximately 30 Finnish men, co-operators, as they called themselves, bought land on Eagle's Nest Lake 1 between Ely and Sudan. It was thought that the Co-op Association owned almost a third of the entire shore of the Eagle's Nest Lake 1. On this section, one section of this large parcel, a peninsula with a ridge, is the spot where the 20 original cooperators each bought their own small plots, building their own private modest cabins. Today, many of those cabins still exist and are still owned by the original descendants of the original cooperators. All the other land was owned by the newly created Co-op Park Association, and it became a large park where Finnish workers and their families were invited from across Minnesota and beyond to come and camp outdoors and enjoy a lake experience each summer. The association believed that all Finns should enjoy, well, probably all people should enjoy a vacation at the lake, not just the wealthier who could afford to buy cabins. Finns came from all over to camp, to put on plays, to sing in choral concerts, and to cook huge communal meals, invite all the local Finns to it. The cooperators also started a summer camp that my father and his sister were lucky enough to attend as long as it existed. The cooperators' important values were passed down through classes taught in Finnish, along with specific camp activities that emphasized cooperation, mutual aid, and the common good. The campers sang in co-op camp chorus, played musical instruments, created a band, put on plays and concerts. There was an elevated stage where the children could highlight their artistic efforts. And of course, swimming was an important daily activity. They slept in Army-issued tents and in Army-issued sleeping bags. Some of Dad's most vivid childhood memories were the men and the boys gathering to build in the original Co-op Point Road over that steep ridge. The adults used dynamite from the mine and to blast in the road, and the dads and sons engaged in lots of pick, shovel, and wheelbarrow work to clear the road. And honestly, that road is in about pretty much the same condition today as it was back then. There were worker bees to build the 20 or so private cabins on the ridge. My grandparents bought this lot so proudly before they owned anything else. They pitched a tent where they lived all summer long for a couple of summers, and like all good Finns, they built the sauna first. The cabin came much later. Dad rode the DM and IR train from Ely to the closest drop-off at Co-op Point. He had many of these field trips often without his parents knowing, with his friends from a very young age through high school. Often neither parent was around. The children were given a great freedom to explore the natural world, and they enthusiastically developed a robust sense of adventure. My dad and his friends built very unique diving towers, which you will see in the short slideshow, in the lake. They gathered wood and different things from the woods, and they built these very tall diving towers where they perfected their diving skills on these, what I consider kind of unsafe contraptions. But needless to say, the co-op point kids became skilled swimmers and went on to win many state championships. Dad marveled that co-op point existed at all, especially through the worst travails of the Great Depression. He remembered only an idyllic childhood, no sense of deprivation or economic hardship. The children at Co-op Point were treated with they were treated as precious gifts by the Finnish cooperators and the grannies and moms. But in reality, the children were shielded and protected from the many hardships that all the grown-ups endured through this time. The lakes and forests, as I've said, were gifts that provided opportunities for adventure, but importantly, during the Depression, the woods provided venison and fish, as well as the lakes, and as well as edible plants for the foragers when times were tough and when food budgets were woefully inadequate to feed their families. Despite the obvious hardship and discrimination my grandparents experienced while forging a new life on the range, they never wavered in their belief that it was the ultimate privilege to live in America, that the dream of America and the great democratic experiment that America was worth it and should never be taken for granted. Till the end of their lives, they believed that America was a land where democratic aspirations of economic and social justice were someday achievable. The print is small, and I apologize. Co-op camp where all the kids came every summer. Contraptions.
Anyone have any questions for Val? We're just back to you, Val. Becky. Val, what?
Now, what was it in 1890?
To suddenly turn against the Finns and persecuting them.
I think that, I think that the Russian Empire started to shrink. I mean, they were going in, I mean, the seeds of the Bolshevik Revolution were already being laid. And I just think that they just didn't want anything, the people getting too independent or whatever, they just shut everything down and then started to pay more attention to what was going on in the mainland of Russia. The Bolshevik I mean, there were people already agitating across the country. Well, I mean, Nicholas and his family were the ones that got thrown out.
But I don't think they were the ones that were there in 1890. I think it was a generation. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, but I think that. Yeah, I mean, the Russian Empire started to contract as they had a lot of internal problems and they were just going to ignore or crack down on Finland.
I have a question. I'm just curious if you are of Finnish heritage, would you please make some visual signal? All right, looks like a pretty good contingency here. I saw another hand raised in the back. Was that a question? I'll come bring you a microphone. Thank you.
It's really not a question, but it's another comment. Val mentioned how about the Russians contracting and so forth, and like today, they've been contracting back and forth. When I was in Finland in '67, we saw part of the Finnish army bicycling along the highway. And they stopped at a park, and so we stopped at a park and said, "What are you doing?" Well, they said they're the Finnish army and they're training for the 47th war with Russia. So the Finns and the Russians was back and forth all the time, and I know my grandmother's naturalization papers say that she's Russian, but we always thought she was Finnish.
Oh, claim the Finnish. Anybody else?
Mr. Shelley, I'll be here in just a moment.
What do you know about opera houses in the area put on by the bird?
Well, I know that the little Finnish, I think it might be a hall now in the Finnish part of Virginia, started as an opera house. And there are many, oh, well, you could speak to that. I mean, Gail, and or Lorraine.
It was back then they called it Fintown, and Kabla Hall was originally an opera house.
Yes, and I mean, they're dotted across the upper, I mean, also in Copper Country of the upper Midwest. In Michigan, the Upper Peninsula is dotted with the same kinds of opera houses. Now they're probably retrofitted to be something else. But it was really amazing. And if I had an aunt who lived, she was a psychiatrist and she lived in Helsinki and died in the last 20 years. But she was an opera buff and she never married, never had children. And she traveled all over the world to follow opera. And so, I mean, it's something that has been passed. I mean, serious music lovers, the Finnish people are indeed. Beth. Oh, sorry.
I was just surfing YouTube and found an interview not too long ago with the ambassador of Finland and was speaking about that the Finns are some of the happiest people in the world. And it's because of all the socialism there. They don't have to pay for college, they have healthcare, they have vacations, they and they have time off when the babies are born, men and women. And so I think they're still alive. Maybe we need to bring English over there and all move over there.
I mean, I know that was a comment, but yes, it really is remarkable. So I think 3 years in running, the Finns have been, through some kind of analysis, been voted the happiest people on the planet. Now, it's not that they're so ha 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 or that expressive. I mean, they're pretty somber and serious people. But what I think is they have the right calibrated expectations for life. They're pleasantly surprised at every part of their existence when things are really great. And I mean, it's just, I think it's got, you know, reasonable expectations for a good life. And I think what Beth said is true. They pay very high taxes, I think maybe 60% of their income, 50% of their income, and they have cradle to grave benefits, excellent benefits, efficient, well-run, wonderful schools that are free, not dependent on zip codes, not dependent on one's parents' wealth. There's equity, there's cooperation, not competition. It's built into their DNA.
It sounds awful, but I have a cousin who went to Finland 20 years ago, and he said, they certainly do smoke a lot in Finland.
Well, I would hope that's changed now since we have so much more health knowledge.
Well, we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Val.